To save the carrier, the destroyer charged straight in front of the enemy's guns. On October the 25th, 1944, the sea east of Samar Island was supposed to be a work site, not a gun line. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded a small escort carrier group. 6 escort carriers ran in his formation. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts guarded them. The group existed for one purpose in that campaign. It kept aircraft over the landings at Leyte, and it hunted submarines that tried to slip into the shipping lanes. The escort carriers were built to carry aircraft, not to absorb battleship shells. The morning began with routine signals and routine motion. Deck crews moved aircraft, fueled them, and armed them with whatever was ready for patrol. Pilots checked engines and climbed aboard with short notice. The carriers turned to meet the wind when they needed launches, then turned back onto their assigned tracks. On the escorts, lookouts watched the horizon and watched the water for signs of a hidden threat. Men expected aircraft. Men expected submarines. They did not expect a Japanese surface force to appear close enough to bring heavy guns into play. The first contact reports arrived in pieces. A lookout called down to a bridge. A detection operator passed a bearing to a talker. A staff officer carried the message into the flag space. Each step took seconds, and seconds mattered. The shapes on the report were large. The contacts were fast. The line of approach stayed steady. As the range closed, the report stopped sounding like a stray patrol and started sounding like a fleet on the move. Sprague had no time for debate. His escort carriers were slow and lightly protected, with no battleships or heavy cruisers to shield them. The landings at Leyte depended on the sea staying open. If Japanese heavy ships reached the transport lanes, they could smash the supply lifeline in one morning. Sprague locked onto one objective: keep the carriers alive long enough to keep launching aircraft, and keep the enemy surface force away from the landing area. Sprague ordered his formation to turn away and run at maximum speed. That order did not make the ships fast. It pushed engines to their limits and pushed crews into emergency rhythm. The escort carriers began to run, and Sprague began to use time as his main weapon. He needed minutes to build distance. He needed minutes to put aircraft in the air. He needed minutes to turn a sudden ambush into a chase that took longer than the enemy wanted. The flight decks became a factory under pressure. Even before the first heavy shells landed near the carriers, deck crews worked in tight lanes with no slack. Men fueled aircraft. Men loaded what ordnance was already on hand. Men pulled chocks and signaled pilots forward. These escort carriers were prepared for patrol and support work, not a brawl with battleships. Sprague accepted that limit because he had no alternative. He could not wait for better weapons or better conditions. He needed aircraft moving now, even if those aircraft could only harass and distract. The escorts understood the other half of the problem. Running alone would not save the carriers. The Japanese ships carried heavier guns and longer range. They could fire while closing. If Sprague's carriers stayed in clear view, the enemy could settle into accurate fire and tear them apart. The escorts had 2 tools that could change that math. Smoke could cut the enemy's sight and range-finding. Torpedoes could force the enemy to turn, and a turning ship lost its best aim and lost time on a straight approach. Commander Ernest Evans on the United States ship Johnston took that logic and turned it into action. Johnston moved ahead of the carriers and began laying smoke. Evans opened fire as he did it. His first salvos were not a promise of sinking a battleship. They were a signal made of steel. They told the enemy, and they told Sprague, that Johnston would not hide behind the carriers. Johnston would stand out front where the enemy had to notice it. The Japanese force answered at once. Heavy shells began to land around Johnston, first short, then closer. Columns of water rose alongside the hull. The shock of near misses punched through the ship and rattled men at their stations. Evans kept Johnston moving and kept the guns firing. He changed course enough to make the enemy correct its aim again and again. Each correction cost time. Each correction helped the carriers behind the smoke. Sprague watched the smoke spread and saw the fight change. The smoke cut the enemy's sight, but it also cut his own information. Inside the screen, the carriers could not track every enemy shift. Smoke protected them and hid an oncoming salvo until the last moment. Sprague loosened his formation, trusted captains to hold spacing, and kept decks turned into the wind whenever launches were possible. Johnston did not have the luxury of staying inside the smoke. If Johnston stayed hidden, the smoke would be a wall with no teeth. Evans pushed Johnston out of the thicker smoke and toward the enemy's approach. He wanted enemy gunners to see Johnston. He wanted enemy commanders to hear reports of torpedoes. He wanted the enemy to treat Johnston as a threat that demanded attention, not a small ship that could be ignored. Then Evans made the move that hardened the threat. He launched a torpedo attack. A torpedo did not need to hit to matter. A torpedo in the water forced a ship's bridge to choose. If the ship held its course, it risked taking a blow below the waterline that could cripple it. If the ship turned away, it lost time and lost its best firing angle. That choice was the effect Evans needed. He did not need a clean kill. He needed the enemy to break a straight, confident run toward the escort carriers. The enemy's motion showed the outcome. Japanese ships shifted course. Some guns paused and resumed on new bearings. The long, steady approach broke into a series of adjustments. Even when the enemy kept firing, the firing rhythm changed. Sprague's carriers used that change as extra distance. The deck crews used it as extra time. Aircraft continued to roll forward, lift off, and climb out of the smoke. Pilots had little time for a careful briefing. They took whatever target cues they could get from voice calls and from flashes beyond the smoke. Some aimed at the nearest silhouettes they could find. Some aimed at the ships that seemed to be leading the chase. The aircraft could not match battleship armor with the weapons they carried that morning, but they did not need to. They needed to keep the enemy turning, keep the enemy cautious, and keep the enemy from aiming in a steady way. Sprague pressed that air effort because it was the only tool that could reach beyond the smoke. He ordered launches again and again. Every launch forced a carrier to turn for wind, and every turn risked opening a gap in the cover. Air crews launched anyway, knowing the return would be worse. A plane might come back low on fuel and find the landing pattern broken by an evasive turn. Inside the smoke, communication became a constraint as hard as steel. The enemy had the advantage of heavy guns. Sprague had the advantage of decentralization forced by chaos. Smoke and distance made it hard for the flagship to control every move. That meant individual captains had to act on intent, not on detailed orders. Johnston's move was the first and clearest example. It was a captain taking a thin tool and using it to reshape the enemy's approach and buy time for the carriers. As the first stage unfolded, the smoke began to thin at the edges. Wind pulled it apart. Openings formed. Through those openings, the carriers caught glimpses of tall splashes and distant flashes. The enemy had not been driven off. The enemy had been delayed, not defeated. The pursuit continued whenever Japanese ships found a clear line. Sprague needed the screen to keep the enemy from settling into steady aim. Other escorts began to angle out, preparing to make their own threats. The United States ship Hoel edged toward the danger area. The United States ship Samuel B. Roberts maneuvered with the same intent. They were still intact. They still had torpedoes. They could still force turns. That meant they still had a way to buy minutes for the carriers and keep the enemy from running straight into the landing area. Johnston remained in front, drawing attention and fire, while the carriers ran and launched. Sprague held the group together, while also letting it spread enough to survive inside the smoke. The plan was fragile, and it was already consuming strength to keep it alive. Smoke hid both sides, and it forced both sides to act with incomplete information. The torpedo attack had forced the first turn, but it had not ended the chase. The escort carriers were still slow. The Japanese ships were still closing whenever they found a gap in the smoke. Sprague saw the smoke break into patches and saw enemy flashes through the openings. The Japanese ships did not slow down for long. They adjusted and kept coming whenever they found a clear lane. That meant the carriers would not win by running alone. They would win only if the screen forced the enemy to keep turning, keep hesitating, and keep losing steady aim. Sprague sent the message that mattered. He needed his small surface ships to attack. He did not need them to survive. He needed them to buy time. The order moved through the smoke in fragments, but the intent was plain. The screen had to put torpedoes in the water and put itself where the enemy could not ignore it. The United States ship Hoel turned out of the carrier wake and headed toward the gun flashes. The United States ship Samuel Roberts did the same. Both ships carried torpedoes. Both ships carried guns too small for a battleship fight. Their captains still chose the same direction because the map on every bridge showed the same problem. If the Japanese ships stayed on a straight run, they would reach the carriers, and then they would reach the landing force. The smoke made the approach harder. It hid the enemy, and it hid the escorts from one another. Hoel pushed forward anyway. The ship cut through lighter smoke, found a gap, and saw what it needed to see. The enemy line was real, and it was close enough to kill. Japanese salvos began to walk across Hoel's path. The first near misses threw water over the bow. The next ones struck closer. Hoel kept moving. The ship's crew stayed at their stations because there was nowhere else that mattered. A man who left a gun mount did not become safer. He just made his ship weaker. Samuel Roberts moved in the same way, fast and committed. The ship had been built to escort and to protect. It had not been built to trade blows with heavy cruisers and battleships. That did not change what the sea demanded from it that morning. It had torpedoes, and torpedoes were one of the few weapons that could bend a battleship's course. In the carrier formation, engines strained, and the wake widened. The escort carriers ran at full speed and still felt slow. They also kept turning to meet the wind, because aircraft kept leaving their decks. Each turn exposed a carrier's side to new bearings. Each turn risked opening the smoke screen. Sprague accepted that risk because a carrier without aircraft in the air was just a slow target. The aircraft reached the enemy with uneven loads and little planning. Pilots dove and fired because each attack forced a reaction and kept the enemy from settling into steady aim. The first attacks did not sink anything. They did something else. They demanded reaction. A heavy ship that turned to avoid a suspected torpedo lost its best firing solution. A ship that threw up spray and smoke to blind an incoming plane lost time on the chase. Each small interruption stacked on top of the smoke and the torpedo threat. The enemy's approach became a series of starts and corrections instead of one clean run. The United States ship Johnston stayed forward and stayed visible whenever the smoke allowed it. Johnston had already made itself a target, and the enemy treated it that way. Heavy shells began to land closer, and then a hit landed hard enough to change Johnston's movement. The ship shuddered and threw debris across a deck. Men on the bridge felt the shock in their teeth and in the deck under their boots. Johnston did not stop. Evans kept his ship moving, even if the movement was no longer clean. The ship's gunners kept firing, even if some mounts went silent. Damage control teams moved into smoke and flame and torn metal. They shut doors. They rigged hoses. They carried wounded men away from open stations so the living could keep the ship in the fight. Sprague could not spare time to track every detail. He had to watch the carriers and watch the enemy's bearing and make the next set of turns that kept flight decks working. That forced a hard form of command. He set the objective and allowed the screen to act. The screen did not need permission for every move. It needed a reason, and it had one. Hoel drove closer and found the range where its torpedoes mattered. The ship's captain had to time the run. If he launched too early, the enemy might turn with room to spare. If he waited too long, he might not live long enough to launch at all. He committed, and the ship ran in under heavy fire. The torpedo crews worked with quick hands and short calls. The tubes trained. The firing circuits were set. Hoel launched. The ship then turned hard to get out of its own danger line and to avoid the enemy salvos that were now focused on it. The turn did not save the ship from all damage, but it forced the enemy to adjust again. That was the real purpose. Samuel Roberts entered its own run with the same logic. The ship was smaller and it had less room to absorb hits. That did not matter at the moment of launch. The captain needed to threaten the enemy's path and disrupt the firing rhythm aimed at the carriers. The ship's crew put torpedoes in the water and then kept the guns firing at targets that looked too large for any sensible fight. When a torpedo threat appeared, Japanese bridges had to respond. A turn was not a retreat, but it was a delay. A delay was what Sprague needed. Smoke, torpedoes, and air attacks worked together, even when no one could see the whole picture at once. The enemy still landed hits on the carriers. One escort carrier began to take fire that hit closer and more often. That carrier was the escort carrier Gambier Bay. The ship had less speed than the enemy, and it needed every knot it could make. Hits and near hits took that away. Gambier Bay's crew fought to keep the ship moving. Damage control teams went below to deal with flooding and to keep power steady. Above, the flight deck crews tried to keep aircraft handling alive, but the ship's motion and the threat of more shells kept cutting into their work. Gambier Bay began to fall behind the other carriers. A ship that fell behind became easier to hit. Sprague faced a choice he did not want. He could slow the whole group to protect Gambier Bay, or he could keep the group running and accept that Gambier Bay might be left exposed. He could not save everything at once. He kept the group moving because if he lost the group, he lost the entire objective. That decision did not erase the cost. It just assigned the cost. Japanese fire continued to search the smoke and the gaps. When shells found Gambier Bay, the effect was immediate. The carrier's speed dropped further. The ship's ability to maneuver began to fail. A carrier that could not maneuver could not keep its deck aligned for launches and recoveries, and it could not escape the next salvo. Gambier Bay's crew kept fighting anyway. Men tried to control fires, men tried to keep steering, men tried to keep wounded men moving to safer spaces. The ship kept taking punishment it was never meant to take. The carrier's wake shortened. The carrier's position slipped aft. The gap between Gambier Bay and the rest of the group turned into a death sentence written in yards, even if no one spoke the number. Meanwhile, the screen continued to sacrifice itself to keep the enemy's aim and attention scattered. Johnston remained a battered shield. Hoel kept pressing attacks and kept drawing salvos that could have landed on a carrier. Samuel Roberts stayed in the fight longer than its design promised. On Samuel Roberts, the gunners fired until barrels heated and crews worked with burned hands. The ship's captain pressed the fight because he needed to keep the enemy's attention split. A heavy cruiser that turned its guns toward Samuel Roberts turned them away from the carriers for a moment. A moment was worth bodies and steel. That bargain showed up as damage. Hits and near hits began to break equipment and kill men at open stations. Gun mounts that had fired steadily went quiet. Communication lines inside the ship failed, and runners had to carry orders through smoke and blast shock. Damage control teams ran to new holes while old holes still took water. Hoel suffered the same pattern. The ship's captain tried to keep its bow pointed where its remaining weapons could matter. He also tried to keep enough motion to avoid becoming a fixed target. He used turns and bursts of speed to spoil the enemy's aim. Each burst consumed the ship's endurance. Each turn exposed the ship to new angles of fire. Hoel stayed in the danger zone because leaving would hand the enemy a clean lane to the carriers. Aircraft kept coming in waves. Some attacked from higher altitude to draw fire, some came in low to strafe and drop small weapons. The pilots learned within minutes that a direct kill was unlikely, but they also learned that they could force reactions. A ship that swung its rudder to avoid a suspected torpedo wake could not keep perfect aim. A ship that threw up smoke to blind aircraft could not see the carriers as well. The air attacks became a constant tax on enemy attention. Sprague used every small effect. He kept launching aircraft whenever he could. He also kept the carriers moving, even when the wind direction forced awkward turns. Those turns created moments when the carriers came into clearer view. In those moments, enemy gunners tried to seize the chance. Gambier Bay no longer had room for chances. The carrier had lost too much speed. The enemy did not need perfect sightlines anymore because Gambier Bay could not run out of the danger. The carrier took more punishment, and the ship's condition crossed a point where recovery was no longer realistic. Gambier Bay's final fight was a sequence of forced actions. The crew fought flooding. The crew fought fire. The crew tried to keep the ship's list from growing. The crew tried to keep the ship afloat long enough for men to abandon in some order. The order did not hold. The sea did not allow it. Gambier Bay began to sink. Men went over the side. Some climbed down lines. Some jumped from lower points. Some landed hard in the water and disappeared for a moment under the surface. The carrier's escorts could not stop to pick everyone up. The enemy was still close enough to punish any ship that slowed down. Sprague's formation ran on, and the sight of Gambier Bay going down did not end the battle. It deepened it. The carriers still had to escape. The screen still had to buy time. The loss proved that the enemy could reach them if the screen failed. Johnston's condition continued to worsen. The ship had taken severe damage and still remained between the enemy and the carriers whenever it could. The ship's remaining guns fired when they had targets. The ship's captain kept the hull in motion to stay useful. That meant Johnston stayed exposed, and exposure brought more hits. As Johnston's ability to maneuver weakened, the ship's options narrowed. Evans could not promise another clean attack run. He could promise only this. Johnston would keep the enemy's attention for as long as the ship stayed afloat. That was not a statement. It was a job that required small acts, minute by minute. Hoel reached the end of its endurance in the same way. The ship had taken too many hits. The sea came in where it was not supposed to. The ship's fighting power fell piece by piece. The captain still tried to keep the ship pointed toward the enemy because turning away would hand the enemy a clearer run. Hoel stayed in the line until it could not. Samuel Roberts also reached a point where the ship could no longer keep up its part of the delay. The destroyer escort had been used as a close attack ship, and the price arrived without negotiation. The ship's structure failed under the punishment. The crew still fought. The ship still fired when it could. The ship eventually had to surrender to flooding and fire, not to the enemy's flag. Men entered the water from multiple ships, and the water became crowded with survivors and debris. The sea did not care about rank. A man in the water had the same problem as every other man in the water. He needed a ship to slow down and pull him out. The battle did not permit many slowdowns. Some escorts did pull men from the water when the immediate fire slackened. They did it in short bursts. They stopped, threw lines, hauled men up, and then ran again. Each rescue risked becoming a target. Each rescue also kept the story tied to individual lives. The Japanese force began to show signs of strain, even as it continued firing. The ships turned more often. The formation looked less steady. The enemy had to track smoke that shifted with the wind, aircraft that kept coming, and torpedo threats that appeared from angles that were hard to predict. The enemy also had to decide what it was really facing. A surface force that expected a clean kill and a clean run into the landing area was now stuck in a dirty fight with incomplete information. Sprague did not know everything the enemy knew or feared. He did not need to. He needed one result. He needed the enemy to keep losing time. Every turn and every pause helped the carriers extend the gap. Every minute the carriers stayed alive, kept aircraft in the air, and kept the enemy under pressure. By the end of the second hour, the screen had been torn apart. Gambier Bay was gone. Johnston was no longer a full fighting ship. Hoel was gone. Samuel Roberts was gone. The surviving ships carried wounded men and damaged gear. They also carried something else. They carried the time that the dead ships had bought. The battle was not finished. The enemy was still present, and the enemy could still choose to close again if it found a clean lane. Sprague still had carriers in motion and aircraft still cycling in the air. The remaining question was no longer whether the fight was costly. The cost had already been paid. The remaining question was whether the cost had pushed the enemy far enough away from the door at Leyte. The Japanese ships did not vanish at once. They drifted out of the tight chase and then angled away in wider turns. Their gun flashes grew less frequent. Their shells landed farther from the running carriers. For the first time since contact, Sprague's formation could feel a thin margin open in the distance. The aircraft overhead kept the margin from closing again. Pilots who had already attacked once went back in with whatever they still had. Some came down steep to force the enemy to throw its rudder over. Some came in low to rake decks and bridges and make gunners duck. The attacks did not need to be decisive. They needed to keep the enemy from relaxing into a clean pursuit. On the carriers, deck crews shifted from emergency launch rhythm to a harder problem. Aircraft needed fuel. Aircraft needed a place to land. Landing required steady wind and steady deck. A carrier that turned into the wind to recover a plane also risked exposing itself to any enemy ship that still had a clear line. Sprague kept his ships moving and kept the turns short. He accepted missed recoveries because a missed recovery was still better than a carrier that stopped running. In the gaps between smoke patches, lookouts searched for the enemy's new bearing. Reports came in with uncertainty. A ship would see masts for a few seconds, then lose them behind haze and spray. Another ship would catch a flash and guess a course. No one on Sprague's bridges could claim a complete picture. That made the next decision heavier. If the Japanese force was truly withdrawing, chasing it would be a mistake. The surviving carriers had limited speed. The surviving escorts had taken damage. The air groups were scattered and low on fuel. A chase could pull Sprague's ships back toward danger and back toward the same heavy guns that had already killed one carrier and multiple screen ships. It could also pull the group out of position for the larger battle around Leyte. Sprague had never been sent there to hunt battleships. He had been sent to keep aircraft over the landings at Leyte and to keep submarines away from the shipping. Sprague held his course away from the enemy. He did not turn his group into a victory lap. He treated the enemy's movement as a threat that could return if he made the wrong move. He kept the carriers running on a safer line. He directed his remaining escorts to stay between the carriers and the enemy's last known direction. He used aircraft as a moving fence line, not as a spear thrown too far. The decision disappointed men who had watched their screen ships die. Some wanted the enemy punished. Some wanted proof that the enemy had been beaten, not just delayed. Sprague could not spend his remaining strength on revenge. He could spend it only on survival and on the mission the landing still needed. Behind the running formation, the sea held the cost in plain sight. Survivors floated among oil slicks and wreckage. Some clung to rafts, some clung to planks, some clung to nothing and only kept their face above water by will. The water carried voices for a while, then carried fewer voices. Rescue began in the only way it could. A ship would edge back when fire slackened. It would slow down for minutes, not hours. Sailors would throw cargo nets, lines, and life rings. Men would be hauled up, sometimes dead weight, sometimes still fighting to climb. The ship would then speed away again if a new report warned of enemy contact. Sprague's ships kept moving while they rescued where they could. The carrier crews made room for wounded men. They treated burns and fractures and blast injuries on decks that were still stained with fuel and sweat from the launch cycle. Officers tried to rebuild order from the fragments. Some escorts had broken communication gear. Some had lost key personnel. Ships passed information by signal when radios failed. They did what was necessary to keep from colliding, to keep from drifting into a new threat, and to keep aircraft from falling into the sea, because the deck was not ready. The air effort continued even as the surface fight thinned out. Some pilots stayed aloft past safe fuel margins. They did it because they did not trust the enemy to stay away. They watched enemy ships from distance and relayed what they could. Their reports were never perfect, but they added weight to Sprague's choice. The enemy was no longer driving straight toward the carriers. The enemy was no longer driving straight toward the landing area. The meaning of that change went beyond the escort carrier group. A Japanese surface force that broke through into Leyte Gulf could have turned the landing area into a slaughterhouse of transport ships and support vessels. It could have cut the supply flow and forced the entire landing operation into crisis. Sprague's group had not been designed to stop that kind of threat. It had still helped stop it by refusing to give the enemy a clear lane and by refusing to let the enemy settle into a confident plan. The enemy's withdrawal had more than one cause, and Sprague did not need to guess a single dramatic reason. He had seen the chain in front of him. Smoke had repeatedly broken the enemy's sight. Torpedoes had repeatedly forced turns that ruined firing solutions and delayed the approach. Aircraft had repeatedly imposed an extra danger that the enemy could not measure in real time. Those factors did not require a miracle. They required persistence. They required small ships and small air groups to keep pressing until uncertainty became the enemy's main burden. That burden showed in the enemy's behavior. A force that expected to crush escort carriers quickly instead fought a confused, time-consuming engagement. It faced torpedo threats from multiple directions. It faced air attacks that never gave it a quiet minute. It faced smoke that turned clear targets into guesses. In that environment, every aggressive choice carried a risk that was hard to price. The enemy lost the window it needed to exploit its heavy guns. When it finally turned away, the window did not reopen. For Sprague's men, the result did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion and anger and a numb count of what was missing. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was gone. The destroyer Johnston was gone. The destroyer Hoel was gone. The destroyer escort Samuel Roberts was gone. Men who had spoken on radios that morning did not answer in the afternoon. Men who had stood at guns were now part of the sea. The survivors carried the story forward in fragments. A ship's crew remembered smoke and sudden turns and shells that landed too close to think. A pilot remembered diving on a ship that looked too big to hurt and still diving because there was no other way to keep it turning. A sailor remembered hauling a man from the water and then watching the ship speed away before finding the next raft. Later, the formal record tried to put those fragments into a usable shape. Reports described the smokescreen as a tool that had real effect, not a gesture. Reports emphasized the value of torpedoes and the value of holding torpedoes in reserve until they could force a meaningful turn. Reports emphasized recognition training because in smoke and confusion, a wrong identification could waste the few weapons that mattered or invite fire from the wrong direction. Those were not moral lessons. They were practical lessons written in casualties. The record also fixed certain actions into a clear sequence. The official account of Ernest Evans on Johnston stated that he led with smoke and gunfire and then pressed a torpedo attack under heavy enemy fire to cover the carrier's withdrawal and the launch of aircraft. That description did not romanticize the outcome. It described a job done in the open at point-blank risk to gain minutes for ships that could not gain minutes any other way. When higher commanders forwarded reports up the chain, they used language that carried weight. They described the conduct of the crews as consistent with the highest traditions of the United States Navy. That sentence did not bring back the dead. It did not refloat a carrier. It did show that the institution understood what had happened in plain terms. A screen had fought as if it were a wall. It had absorbed the force meant for the ships behind it. It had made the enemy doubt its own advantage long enough for the landing force to keep breathing. The final settlement returned to the simplest ledger. The landings at Leyte kept their sea line. The transport and support system at the door did not get smashed by heavy guns. The price was paid by ships that were never supposed to fight that battle. The price was paid by crews who went to sea to escort and found themselves charging battleships. In the end, Sprague's group did not win by destroying the enemy. It won by imposing delay and disorder until the enemy could no longer act with confidence. Smoke, torpedoes, and aircraft did not create a miracle. They created a problem the enemy could not solve fast enough. That problem bought time. That time kept the door at Leyte from being kicked in.